But good morning. It is very great to be with all of you here today, and I really want to thank Wycliffe College for inviting me to join you at this event. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Andreae Sennyah, and this morning I'm going to be exploring with you the public policy dimension of what it means to be human. So a little bit about me before I get into it. I know Stephen had already mentioned, but I am from Calgary and attended the University of Calgary studying international relations and political science. During my studies, as Stephen mentioned, I interned at a number of places, including 2 federal government departments. When I finished my undergrad, I was full of optimism about how the world could be changed through public policy. And then I entered my work life as a political staffer in provincial politics. For those of you who are curious about life in politics, there is a quote that is widely attributed to Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of the unified state of Germany. It goes something like this: "To retain respect for sausages and laws, one must not watch them in the making." Thank you, thanks. Those are hearty chuckles that I heard, so thank you, I appreciate it. But jokes aside, my experience in Alberta politics was a deeply formative time. After confronting the practical realities of political life, I emerged from that experience knowing that yes, public policy can make a difference in the world, but it certainly wouldn't be as easy as I thought. Today, I'm the director of policy for a think tank called CARDIS. Our name is Latin for Main Street. This Main Street, or Cardo in Latin, was an ancient north-south road that connected the people of Roman cities to major public spaces. In Canada today, CARDIS is a non-partisan think tank dedicated to clarifying and strengthening the ways in which society's institutions can work together for the common good. For a little background, the word think tank originated during the Second World War as a place for military plans and strategies to be discussed. It eventually evolved to describe organizations that conduct policy research. Think tanks are positioned somewhere between academia and government, bringing sound research to bear on the policy issues of today. What makes CARDIS different from our peers is that we are Christians. Our work is informed by the Christian tradition as it has developed over the centuries, seeking the good of all people, regardless of their faith or their absence of faith. Some of the core themes of this tradition are familiar to you all, namely that human beings are made in the image of God, that the poor and disadvantaged deserve special attention, that governments have an important but limited function, and that civil society institutions should be enabled to thrive. Our research covers the areas of education, family and health policy, work and economics, and religious freedom. Our main vision is of people, institutions, and governments working together for the common good. These institutions include the voluntary sector, the family, schools and labor unions, and faith communities. Our goal is to see the whole picture of human life with all its complexity and interconnectedness. So my reference to the Bismarck quote notwithstanding, I do have a lot of respect for public policy and the policy process. My goal today is to take you through how the state views the human person in its policy approaches, particularly when it comes to the policy areas that I just mentioned. In this discussion, I am going to look at particular policy issues and the view of the human person that is implicit in these approaches. I will then discuss 2 concepts, the concept of sphere sovereignty and the concept of subsidiarity, as tools for understanding how to order our common life. Finally, I want to leave you with 2 questions that I hope will serve as practical tools for how you can think about public policy going forward. Okay, before going on, I must make a small confession. Catholic in me much prefers to do this in private, but I trust that we're all friends here, and so I will go on. The question of what it means to be human is one I will spend my whole life asking and attempting to answer. As we discuss it today, I'm going to make some necessary generalizations in the interest of clarity and brevity. The treatment of each policy question will not reflect the full nuance of the issues at hand. There are no doubt more books to be read, more lectures to be heard, and more discussions to be shared to further mature my answers to these questions. And so, to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, I labor in these deprecations because my efforts to be clear may suggest a confidence which I by no means feel. If anything here is useful to you, use it. If anything is not, never give it a second thought. Okay, with my public confession out of the way, let me start by articulating my priors and the concepts that are going to form the basis of this talk. Foundationally, and rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I believe that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. This truth is the source of the inherent dignity of the human person. Equipped with this fundamental truth about who we are, I want to briefly answer the question of why public policy matters. God's call in Genesis for us to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it is sometimes referred to as the cultural mandate. The foremost calling in this mandate is our capacity to create human life. From there, everything from art to agriculture is encompassed in the cultural mandate. It follows that this call to create is also true in the realm of public policy. St. John Paul II affirms this by referring to God as the first legislator. With this in mind, the human work of legislating or making public policy is an opportunity to participate in God's creative project and to bring about a more just and peaceful society. So, how does the state view the human person? And what do I really mean by the state anyway? For those of you who are looking forward to an extended discourse on the pre-political, philosophical, and moral foundations of the state, I am very sorry to disappoint. My use of the term the state will be much more practical. For the sake of simplicity, I will use it as a catch-all term to refer to a number of actors. These encompass various policymakers, such as elected officials, their political staff, and civil servants. I will also use it to refer to state actors across the many institutions and arms of government. This includes the federal parliament or provincial legislatures, government departments and agencies, and other institutions that enact and enforce policy. The state, as I have defined it, also has a number of tools at its disposal. Falling under the umbrella term of public policy, the state creates legislation and regulation, makes policies and procedures, and delivers programs and services. Included in that is the state's ability to enforce laws, and of course, not forgetting the power to tax and spend. So let us return to our conception of the human person as being created in the image and likeness of God. In the public policy context, the critical thing to remember is that human dignity is not something that is conferred upon us by the state. Human dignity is something that we have by virtue of our existence. It is constant in the best way possible, unchanging regardless of age and equal irrespective of ability. Having been created in the image and likeness of God, human beings are also irreducible. Drawing heavily from Catholic social teaching, I want to highlight three particular aspects of the human person. The first is that human beings are unique and unrepeatable. As the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church puts it, it is not the intellect, consciousness, and freedom that define the person. Rather, it is the person who is the basis of the acts of intellect, consciousness, and freedom. These acts can even be absent, for even without them, man does not cease to be a person. A second dimension of the human person is that we are social beings. Reflecting the Trinitarian God in whose image we are created, human beings are made to be in relationship with one another. Again, quoting from the compendium, the social nature of human beings is not uniform, but is expressed in many different ways. In fact, the common good depends on a healthy social pluralism. The different components of society are called to build a unified and harmonious whole, within which it is possible for each element to preserve and develop its own characteristics and autonomy. The third aspect I want to highlight is the human capacity for self-transcendence. This reflects our innate desire as creatures to be in relationship not only with one another, but with our Creator, with God Himself. And so to recap, human beings have an inherent dignity, we are created for community, and for relationship with God. I want to apply these concepts to the 5 program areas that form the basis of Cardis's work. In doing so, I will draw on some current policy approaches and consider the extent to which the state properly acknowledges these core elements of what it means to be human. And before anyone throws their rotten tomatoes in my general direction, I want to say that my examples will critique policy approaches that come from various parts of the political spectrum. This is not supposed to be an indictment of any one political party or candidate. Okay, I'll start with the area of health policy, which is very familiar to many in this audience. Looking at the example of euthanasia and assisted suicide, the state's view has evolved from viewing human dignity as inherent to a conception of human dignity as a kind of radical autonomy. This dignity as autonomy position privileges personal choice. Life is only valuable if a person chooses it. If they want to live, their life has value. If they do not, their life can be ended at will. The policy consequences of this view of the human person becomes increasingly apparent today as the state continuously expands access and eligibility for euthanasia. On the other hand, the policy consequences of viewing dignity as inherent are numerous. For a start, it would recognize that the dignity of the human person is unchanged even as they are dying. Further, instead of viewing end of life as a burden that the dying impose upon the living, we can instead create policies that affirm that human beings are relational, that we are made for community, and that we are participants in reciprocal relationships of care and responsibility. The next area I want to discuss is education policy. Take, for example, the funding of K-12 education and the general approach in Canada, which has been to fund certain types of schools, either fully or at a higher rate, based on their affiliation with the state. Here in Ontario, independent schools do not receive any public funding. Now let's ask ourselves, what view of the human person is implicit in this education funding model? Does it situate children within the family and recognize the primary right of parents to choose how to best educate their children? Or is the state arrogating certain parental rights to itself by showing a policy preference for one type of school over another? I want to be clear that public schools are critically important to the educational landscape, but they are not the only part of the educational landscape. On another side of this issue, some people believe that free market principles are the only ones that should apply, even to education. Cardis's argument in all of this is that education is a societal good. It is in our collective interest that the next generation of citizens receives a good education, and that good schools are forming good citizens. But we also believe that young people are not citizens first, and that their identity within the family unit is prior. We argue that parents have a prior right to determine the education of their children, and we think that our policies should reflect this. Let's turn our attention now to family policy. The example I want to discuss is around childcare and parental leave. On both sides of the political spectrum, there is a tendency for the state to atomize women and men strictly as economic units or contributors to the GDP. This is especially problematic when those same men and women are not also seen in their roles as fathers and mothers. Policies that subsidize only certain forms of childcare, or that make it difficult for people to go on maternity or paternity leave, or policies that penalize earning small amounts of income when these parents are on leave. All of these policy approaches can privilege economic productivity over the care of children, especially in the early developmental years of their lives. This view of the human person, estranged from the natural institution of family, undermines the strength of our most fundamental institution and ultimately has negative consequences for the state as a whole. On both education policy and family policy, a more authentic view of the human person recognizes that we are created for relationship. Flowing from this, we recognize that each child and each family is different. that parents have the primary authority for the care of their children, and that there are prior social bonds, especially to the family, that take precedence over things like labor force participation. Speaking of labor force participation, Cardis's approach to work can be summed up in one sentence. Work is about more than money. As I said previously, we are created for relationships, and the relationships we form at work are one important dimension of who we are. Just as we heard from the compendium earlier, different components of society are called to build a unified and harmonious whole. Relationships amongst employees, the formation of employee groups like unions, and the relationship between employees and their employers are all critical. So I want to take the example of the issue of disability employment policy. We know that communities formed at work are important for reducing loneliness and social isolation. These workplace communities are critically important for the social participation of everyone, especially people with disabilities. This is why we believe that disability employment policies should be biased towards work. What this means is that, for example, an income support program that reduces support for every dollar that a person earns may not actually be achieving the intended aims of both employment and social inclusion. Policies that put up barriers to work for people with disabilities are barriers for them to participate in the same cultural mandate that we've all been given. When the state introduces income support programs that focus solely on our economic productivity, without considering the non-monetary benefits of work, they fail to consider the relational aspect of the human person and undermine the very social and economic benefits of work to begin with. Okay, the third aspect of the human person I mentioned is our capacity for self-transcendence. This manifests most clearly in policies related to religious freedom. As our society becomes increasingly secular, the state has had a growing tendency to view religion as just one of many things that people do. To a degree, it explains why the LCBO had more generous capacity restrictions than places of worship did at numerous points during the pandemic. The state's failure to understand that religion appeals to our deepest transcendental longings also gives some insight into secularization policies. For example, the limits on wearing certain religious clothing when serving in public roles. If religion is just one of many things that we do, it can just as easily be something that we don't do. Okay, based on this cursory discussion of various public policies, we start to get a sense that the Imago Dei conception of what it means to be human doesn't align very neatly with the left-right political spectrum or with any political party. And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, Andrea, you've walked us through some of the ways that the state fails to recognize the fullness of our identity as human beings. But surely the state can't do everything. And you would be right. In defense of the state, some government policy is necessarily simple, dealing with limited aspects of an issue. After all, if a policy is too particular, it risks becoming convoluted, and if it's too general, it risks becoming ineffective. So this is where the second half of my argument comes in. The fullness of what it means to be human is only achieved when we engage with more than just the state and the market, and actually include all of society's institutions. Two concepts that are helpful for understanding this is the Catholic concept of subsidiarity and the concept of sphere sovereignty articulated by Abraham Kuyper. There are a few ways I could go about explaining subsidiarity and sphere sovereignty, but I think a quick story may better illustrate the point. And so I want to introduce you to Jane. Jane is a wife and a mother of two. She attends her local church with the family every Sunday. By day, Jane is a carpenter working on building sites across the city. And in the evenings and on some weekends, Jane takes her boys to soccer practice and to their games with the community league. Once every month, Jane attends her local union meeting. And once every 4 years or so, Jane goes to her local public school to vote in municipal, provincial, and federal elections. Now, last week, Jane and her husband had reached their wits' end about a pothole the size of a small crater in front of their house. They emailed their municipal councillor about it, and it was, almost miraculously, sealed by the city less than a week later. Some of you may be wondering what municipality she's living in, and so am I, to be honest, but each of these communities, the family, the church, the school, and the worksite, the union, and the soccer league, are all spheres that constitute Jane's life. Each of these communities or spheres manifests an element of Jane's identity and her humanity. She forms these communities, and these communities form her. But it is appropriate that each sphere remains sovereign. That is to say, that each community doesn't absorb the other. It is appropriate, for example, that the discussions at her local union meeting do not devolve into conversations about how to coach her son's soccer league, and vice versa. While this may be painfully obvious to you, I tell this story to illustrate the concept of sphere sovereignty. Okay, again, it is appropriate that Jane emailed her municipal councillor and not her federal MP about the pothole in front of her house, and that grievances with Jane's employer begin at the union level before escalating to the courts. This illustrates the concept of subsidiarity in practice, which is basically the idea that decisions should be made as close to the local level as possible. And while the state has an important role, it is not the only role. Across the spheres and levels of Jane's life, two things remain constant. The first is Jane herself. Living as an integral human being, Jane is no less a wife and a mother at work, and nor is she any less a carpenter by trade when she is at the community soccer league. The second constant is that Jane is a Christian. Her life, like yours and mine, is irreducibly complex, but something deeper and more transcendental needs to hold it all together. A higher loyalty that rightly orders all the spheres and Jane's actions within each of them. So earlier I mentioned that the cultural mandate from Genesis calls us to be creative. But anyone who has built Legos with a toddler knows that it is much harder to create and much easier to destroy. The challenge of creating laws and proposing policies is a significant one. As I went through the various policy approaches, some of you may have been uncomfortably shifting in your seats or politely clearing your throats with disapproval. The truth is, we can all agree on the same right principles, but disagree on the details of each policy program. And the scientists in this room know that both trial and error are essential to any real study. But fortunately or unfortunately, there is no vacuum in which to test public policy. Achieving good policy requires expertise in the field, authentic debate, discernment, evaluation, and most importantly, the willingness to adjust when circumstances change. Part of being human in the policy process is recognizing our limits, but still having the courage to take action. And so, as promised, I want to offer two questions that may be helpful to you in evaluating public policy going forward. When you consider a policy approach, I invite you to ask yourself, your friends, and your legislators. First, what understanding of the human person is implicit in this policy approach? And second, what is the role of the other communities in society in addressing this problem? These questions should spur conversations beyond your usual left and right, and will hopefully cut right to the heart of what we think it means to be human and how we live out that identity in our common life. This approach to public policy is not just some esoteric musing. I believe that it has the potential to be transformative for our discussions in an increasingly polarized society, and can liberate us from some of the pathologies in our public life. I know that conversations around public policy can often leave listeners feeling a little bit hopeless about the future of our society. It sometimes feels as though the scale of the challenges we confront are too great to bear. In the interest of not leaving you with that lingering taste of despair, I want to close with this thought. Canada's coat of arms displays the motto, Desiderantes Melioram Patria. This Latin phrase means they desire a better country. I think it's telling that we hold to this motto. As Canadians, it indicates our desire to always be improving. As Christians, it reminds us of our need to work towards authentic progress that strives to uphold our identity as being created in the image and likeness of God. Now, the truth is that some of us give too much importance to politics and public policy. And while politics is not nothing, it's not everything. The phrase, they desire a better country, actually comes from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 16. In talking about Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and Sarah, the full passage from Hebrews says this: they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. So, as we engage in the public square, we would do well to remember that yes, our work here is important, but it should always be balanced with the certainty that we too are longing for a better country, not just an earthly one, but a heavenly one. Thank you.